you so much. As usual, very interesting. Just to start, this kind of question things, and I just wanted to know in terms of percentages of nationalities. So you worked with a number of schools.
Yeah.
What were the kind of divisions, in terms of countries and stuff like that? I'm interested to know how many Sudanese, for instance, you work with.
I don't think we had the exact kind of nationalities, but I think we had the ethnic backgrounds rather.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we had I'll have to look back at the kind of the percentage of Arab. I think we had sort of South Asian, Arab, North African, rather than So we kind of went for the census type of categorization. I have to look back, but I think, overall it wasn't a high number. I think the majority were kind of South Asian. Even if we...
When you say South Asian,
so
Pakistan,
Bangladesh.
Okay.
There were a few kind of North African and Arab, but as I said, unfortunately, I don't have the exact kind of percentage in terms of Sudan. I mean, I know that in London there are quite few, but unfortunately, I can't.
No, man, I think this is an excellent piece of work, and I appreciate the difficulty in taking such work because of the diversity, huge diversity in terms of ethnic background, the different approaches which are taken, and then the different local setting in which the schools are taken, whether it is you are working in a local authority with a good sort of approach to it. So, saying that, I think the research covered the macro level, the interrelationship between communities, and then within the community, and then at the individual level at the school level. So very vast area to cover in such a small piece of research. What I would have, a couple of things is that there was no room to compare between different faith schools, for example. This is an area which I think would be very interesting to see. Also saying that it is difficult because the variety and diversity within the community. At the same time, one would have liked one day to see across faith differences, because now the focus on the Islamic schools, on whatever Islamic thing, right, because of radicalization, Daesh, IS and whatever. How that differ from the Jewish schools or the Catholic schools and whatever. This is across communities or between different communities. Within the school itself, there is some issue which we never talk about, like issues like gender, for example. Are these schools mixed schools, or is this typically Muslim, 90% of them are boys, or are these separate Muslim madrasas for girls and schools? Then another issue is the very interesting aspects about gates and whether we have bridges or we have... my interest in the topic also comes from my work in the refugee sector, but as well I was involved in a program of funding from Trust for London, as one of the basic funders of supplementary schools in London. And we used to do and assess schools for grants. And I think when you find a huge variety, but you can use funding as a tool of influencing what's going into school, because that gives you access to them, and they can listen to you in a way, right? And I just wonder if institutions like the National Resource Center or funder organizations, right, or local authorities can offer a small thing so that makes schools come out, because we say invisibles. Are they invisible, or are we blind to them, right? So I'll be offering something, and I see lots of recommendation here, which perhaps if adopted can open the gates or make the communication. Because again, I think we usually say all those schools are not open, or all those schools are like, they are not doing their bit. The teacher, it is the role of the teacher to make the school open or not. I think that's just blaming the other side, which is really under-resourced, right? Working as a volunteer or very, very small. It is the responsibility, it is our responsibility as a community, as a local authority, as funders, as whatever, to open this, to create these villages, right? That's the only criticism which I can say in some of these recommendations, because we are blaming the weaker side here, right? You can't say a school guy who is a volunteer perhaps, or as a non-British perhaps, to shoulder him all this responsibility. Because that just stems from, I believe, that community cohesion or integration is sort of a two-way process. You do your bit, I do my bit. You can't just say, why don't you come to me, why you are invisible to me. Perhaps you are also, the other side is also invisible. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for your excellent questions. So I think I would like to start with the first one around why not focus on other or kind of do research on where we are comparing other faith groups. So we thought about that, and we thought that the kind of the research gap is around madrasas. And not necessarily other faith supplementary schools. And particularly before we started the research, there was a report from the London Metropolitan University that looked at these issues, which is called Impact of Supplementary Schools on Pupils. And so we thought, okay, well, what we could do is start with the madrasas research and maybe later kind of seek some funding to do other faith groups, but so trying to pretend that we're interested in other, faith groups and then insert the madrasas was just disingenuous from our part, so we thought we were just going to tackle the issue head on. So that was the main reason, really. In terms of gender, yes, this is a very important question. So the picture was very mixed. In some schools, they said, according to the survey, in some schools they said that they were gender segregated, in others that they weren't. And often there was kind of a correlation between the kind of the size of the school, the kind of the teaching approach, and so the ones that were kind of a little bit more open to kind of building partnerships and kind of running the sessions in a mainstream school and all that were less likely to have segregated classes, and then the ones that were much smaller or run in a mosque, they would systematically go for segregated classes. Now, the very important question around blaming the kind of the weaker side, and sort of a lot of recommendations were targeted around kind of trying to make these institutions kind of reach out to other bigger institutions and not the other way around. I think, to be honest, we sort of tried to. I think there were a few recommendations around the kind of responsibility of local authorities as well. But essentially, this piece of research conducted at the Institute of Public Policy Research, which often kind of weighs its kind of recommendations around the practicality of implementation of recommendations. So in terms of funding, if we say that local authorities should all start a program of outreach to all these institutions, where is the funding going to come from when all the councils are, the local authorities are facing cuts. So I think the recommendations were also written with that in mind, rather than thinking that, most of the responsibility is on the side of the madrasas and not the other way around. And I think, it's, it's absolutely true. It's not about the kind of whether we have such initiatives, but it's also about the willingness. I mean, how would you convince a small supplementary school that's run in a mosque to try and, improve its policies, use a different curriculum, and, if you're not trying to provide some sort of incentive, if you're not saying that it's not a threat to its identity as a supplementary school, then there is no way you can convince them. Because ultimately, these institutions have been set up with the willingness to try and preserve a sense of identity that's kind of unspoiled and not necessarily in contradiction with the kind of, but still. So I think there is that fear also of accepting funding, for instance, from certain institutions that will systematically impose conditions on what they teach and what they don't teach, etc., etc. So, yes, I think there is the kind of, some who want to stay invisible because they have to maintain a degree of independence, and others who, who want to be more visible but can't. And then I think, is there a question? Yeah.
I think for me it is a general issue about, I think the right approach is to mainstream any service, right? To ensure that this service, right, is open, there is no conflict. If I think about mainstreaming this, if there is a need, if the community identifies such a need, and if, like, take the extreme example of Tawai Hamlet, for example, where the Islamic schools is about 70% of service is Asian. So, in a government-funded school where 70% of students are Bengali or whatever, it's strange to have a supplementary school, right, to provide additional supplementary stuff for the 70% students who are there in the mainstreams. In that case, I think it is the Christian in that school who should have a supplementary school there, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a service for the community, and it is the community who define what's supplementary and what's mainstream. In this case, this is the mainstream, right? You should do it in a way which is right with law, British law, with British values and whatever, but provide it within the school, and then rather than leave the school out, Muslim students out during Christian whatever, or in such a school where we study. I don't know whether it's just making the point here of thinking of mainstreaming these services wherever it is possible, rather than having ghettos of small schools. But I'm quite sure that this is an extremist point. But this is ideal for me. Every service which is defined by the community, if possible, should be mainstreamed, and this is the safety valve for the community. I'm not expecting it to be happening, but this is my dream.
I mean, I'd like to bring Andy, in a bit, maybe to comment on that, and maybe from a local authority perspective, whether some of that mainstreaming is imaginable at all in terms of practicality. I think such an idea would probably not face criticism from, in terms of kind of implementation, so whether like funding, etc. But also, I think in terms of what sort of message would you kind of, in a local community, is is it kind of Islamization of mainstream schools? It's, you know, and also if you kind of, when you, in the current context where you have, unfortunately, a lot of negative coverage of all what's associated with Islamic values or Islamic, you know, kind of mainstreaming that sounds quite a threatening, you know, frightening sort of idea. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong, but I don't think it's, you know, it will get a lot of support. Even if you have 70% or even 80% of pupils who are Muslim background in certain schools. I mean, there's the other debate around kind of sort of mainstream Islamic schools. I mean, those are different types of institutions. So, but yeah, when you have kind of, I think that's yeah. I don't know what you think about this, but
in terms of localism and whatever, is that
Yeah.
localism? Is that an example of localism?
yeah.
Yeah, that would be to devolve quite a lot of responsibility for education policy to the local level. I
So
guess
it's kind of free schools type of thing. I
Yeah.
mean, if you change
free
it
schools
into
might have
free-
more freedom to take the kind of religious curriculum in the school. I personally, I'm in favour, I guess, of schools being largely secular in their curriculum. So, you know, just as I wouldn't necessarily want to see a lot of kids' time spent during the day at mainstream school studying Quran, nor would I want them, you know, in Bible study either. I mean, I do think that if people want to pursue religious education beyond a kind of basic understanding of faith that you get through existing religious studies classes, then the place for that is probably outside of the kind of 9 till 4 daytime school system. But I'd apply that equally to any faith, not just to...
The other thing really is that I think supplementary schools should be really interpreted as the most positive sign of integration. Why? Because a lot of the families choose not to take their children to sort of Islamic schools, full-time Islamic schools. They want them to go to mainstream schools and then supplement their education with the kind of, you know, supplementary schools. So it's really the most positive sign of integration, because they don't want their children to be completely isolated from the school system in the UK, schooling system in the UK. So in a way, I think maintaining that would be more positive than kind of, increasing the number of Islamic schools, I think.